That's a hard talk to follow. Maximal quality, maximum efficiency. I think mine will be a bit different. This actually, it starts with some work that Philip was doing, I warned you, on leiomyosarcoma, and he'll talk your ear off on that in terms of a cancer, a sarcoma with profound chromosomal instability and an approach where one takes that innate instability and tries to push the cells over the edge with a sensitizing dose of anthracycline, namely Doxil, coupled with a DNA PK inhibitor. But this is showing a genome-wide tracing of the copy number alterations in two typical leiomyosarcomas, contrasting that with a malignant GIST. And when I put RTK in the title, receptor tyrosine kinase, for today we're talking about GIST, about cancers that most of the time are driven, initiated by KIT or PDGFR RTK mutations. Okay? And obviously the tracings couldn't be more different. GISTs we've come to think of as they're not just genomically stable, but they're almost addicted to stability, and that we see as an opportunity. Okay, so I'm going to just sort of spell out what a few slides of data will be showing us in advance, and then with the conclusions, I will underscore that again. So the questions include, why are GISTs genomically stable? Well, leiomyosarcomas, we think, much of the time start with P53 and RB inactivation, so they have derailment of cell cycle checkpoints, DNA damage response from the very beginning. But GISTs, by the time they become a high-ish grade kind of a cancer, they start very benign, very low grade. They can also acquire P53 and RB mutations, and yet they don't become genomically stable, and unstable, with a few exceptions that I'll come back to at the very end. So why are they stuck on stability? And then the second bullet point, if nothing else from this talk, if you leave understanding what an apple is, AP/AL, then I'll be delighted, okay? Because it's a new term we've coined that hasn't yet been published, but I'll explain it, okay? So using genomic instability, forced instability, whether it's in the laboratory, to rapidly generate models of new therapeutic challenges. That'll be another part of the presentation, and I'll just move along. So how did we get into this, beyond this ongoing fascination that GISTs and leiomyosarcomas, although arguably arising from a similar pluripotential mesenchymal cell, are so different with respect to chromosomal instability? One thing, this is Adrian Marino Enriquez in our group, had done a genome-wide shRNA screen amongst various GIST models, and found that topoisomerase 1, that thing that relaxes the DNA as it's synthesized to avoid damage, is a highly essential gene in all of the models. So that grabbed our attention. And then 2 years ago, Lori Rink and Meg von Maren at Fox Chase reported a really nice story where WEE1 inhibition, one of the key DNA damage response kinases, in combination with a KIT or PDGFR inhibitor, creates synergies. And we began thinking, okay, the tumors are stable, but maybe they have safeguards that keep them that way, and could KIT signaling itself be part of that process? You know, and there's a backdrop for this, which the clinicians in the room who are long in the tooth like me will be aware of, which is that in the pre-imatinib era for GIST, that is pre-2000, it was well known that cytotoxics, conventional chemotherapeutics, have virtually no clinical activity in GIST. So although I'm going to kind of make a story that GISTs need to stay stable, there's also a part of it which is it's not so easy to change that. You would think if they need to stay stable that a DNA damaging agent would be their death knell, but that's clearly not the case. Okay. So this slide, here's our blueprint, and the case that we're going to make, and you know, I would take about half of this with a grain of salt, although we've done it from many different directions, many different models, because it's not that we've tried for peer review. We're just at the point of peer review submitting all of these things. But this is our vision, our version, rather than something that everybody else has agreed with. We have strong data, and again, Philip, much to his credit, got involved in much of this, that the KIT PDGFR oncogenic signal itself optimizes DNA damage response in GIST. So that's part of the reason that they stay on track and so almost seem like they're averse to picking up chromosomal instability. And that runs specifically through the ROS/ROF Mech pathway, down to ATR, and then following ATR, its usual DNA damage response mechanisms. ATR phosphorylates CHEK1, BRCA1 is phosphorylated, and BRCA1 together with ATR make sure that the activated CHEK1, a key player in DNA damage response, is stable, and that leads to phosphorylation of WEE1 and ultimately cell cycle arrest so that the DNA damage can be fixed. And what we thought, our TOPO1 focus as a starting point came from that genome-wide functional genomics screen that I mentioned, and we've stayed with that, although we think that's hardly the only way to stir the pot a little bit and create a bit of DNA damage in concert with inhibiting DNA damage response. But I think there are other ways to go after that, okay? So just a few slides that get to this. The second lane in the blot here is the critical one. This is one of the number of GIST models that we use, and you're seeing that TOPO1 inhibition fosters ATR activation. The threonine 1989 is an indicator of ATR activity, and BRCA1 phosphorylation increases, leading to phosphorylation or activation of CHEK1. And the critical lane then is beyond that is the one at the far right, where we've used a dose of ripretinib, 20 nanomolar in vitro, which is easily achieved clinically in a patient in combination with the TOPO1 inhibitor to largely squelch that response. And then, as shown in the following slide, the middle panel, the combination then fostering apoptotic response in the form of PARP cleavage and cleave caspase. And one of the things, this was a straightforward model. We're using ripretinib against a GIST model that has a KIT exon 11 mutation. Those are very sensitive to ripretinib and to most KIT inhibitors. But what about a target, and I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk, which is only quasi-responsive to ripretinib, this newly approved KIT inhibitor? Well, one such target is the most common of the imatinib resistance mutations, imatinib being the first-line therapy for GIST, which is a second mutation in cis with the primary mutation in the ATP binding pocket, namely V654A. And we know from the initial data on ripretinib progression that that's also a mutation that is substantially cross-resistant to ripretinib. But there is some activity, not enough probably to cause arrest of GIST growth in most patients, but something biologically. If you couple a target that's like modestly inhibited by a KIT inhibitor with a targeting either a DNA damaging agent, here it's SN38, the active metabolite of irinotecan, to foster some damage, or a DNA damage response inhibitor, can one see an additive effect? And the graphs at the far right show that that's the case. This is the part of the data that I trust the least in terms of that it will actually work this way clinically, that a modest downregulation of KIT activation coupled with TOPO1 inhibition or a DNA damage response inhibition will be enough. Okay. And then I'd mentioned before that we have strong evidence, thanks to Philip's work, that Mech as a signaling intermediate is particularly important in recapitulating that response that we saw combining KIT inhibition and then TOPO1 inhibition. And that's shown in the panel on the left, on the two lanes at the right, again with extinction of the CHEK1 activation by combining TOPO1 inhibitor with, in this case, trametinib as the Mech inhibitor. Okay, so next part of the story. This was started by Gavi Cohn in the lab and then brought to fruition by Lydia Wilson. We'd noticed somewhat by accident that when Cas9, that enzyme that's used as part of the CRISPR process, is stably expressed in GIST cells, it foments general genomic instability. So rather than being a surgical tool, there's a general increase in instability. And once we knew that, we thought, can we couple this with traditional approaches to random mutagenesis? E and U is one compound that is used to mutagenize. You treat the cells for about 24 hours. And the answer is yes, it can, and we were able to generate a plethora of resistance mutations to drugs of interest in an unprecedented amount of time. I'm going to bore you with the details, I'm sorry, but in 15 years, about 4 of our labs that were intent on developing TKI-resistant sublines of the standard GIST models like GIST-T1 came up with 4 successes. Brian Rubin's group in Cleveland got one, Sebastian Bauer's group in Germany got 2, we got 1, okay? Different second mutations that arose by growing the cells in an inhibitor. And here in this case, we're able to generate loads of those within about 3 weeks. And so the approach is you have Cas9 in the cells, you mutagenize for 24 hours, because it's a rapid time frame that allows you to try a lot of mutagens, not just ENU, EMS, doxorubicin. We should probably think about radiation therapy, would be interesting, right? And then by the same token, the selection pressures that one can apply, not just TKIs, but HSP90 inhibitors, you can be more creative with that because it all happens more quickly. And so what Lydia did here, this was a D842V, the most common PDGFRA mutation in GIST model, and there was a clinical report led by Sebastian's group and ours in Cancer Discovery a few years back that showed from a small group of patients, that's the column on the left, what the second mutations were after the D842V that caused resistance to the now standard drug avapritinib. Lydia, by doing this, what we call enhanced mutagenesis, was able to create all of those with a few exceptions and then some additional ones, the middle column, within 4 weeks. And I'm just going to direct your attention to PDGFRA V658A, that's halfway down. That's the same amino acid change that we know well in KIT as V654A. And likewise, T674R, which was identified in one patient, and Lydia found the variants T674 to an A or to an I or to an R. That's the gatekeeper mutation. So for KIT, that would be T670I, just to ground those who understand GIST well. Mijin in our group is has the wonderful hands in these cultures that are a mixture of different mutant cells to unravel them all by limiting dilutions, which she has done with aplomb for PDGFRA resistance mutations and KIT resistance mutations. Whoops, what happened? Oh, we're back. Okay, and so, staying with the PDGFRA, and now we're back on track with intermittently, okay. Is it flickering up there as well? Oh, we're good, okay. So with about 7 different second mutations in concert, it's the same allele with the starting D842V in these PDGFRA models. In this case, Bella mixed them all together and used doses of drugs that on their own were not substantially cytotoxic or even cytostatic, and asked what sort of combinations between targeting PDGFRA, TOPO1, DNA damage response, or going all downstream, like combinations of TOPO1 inhibition plus a DNA damage response inhibitor would be seem to have promise for moving into mouse studies, which is the point that we're at now. And the nice thing about this is you can obviously see from the cell response. These are about 12-day assays we like to do. That would be about the shortest assay that we like to do because low doses of drug and the idea of incremental DNA damage rather than a sledgehammer to the cell. We know from previous clinical studies that one could certainly do a KIT inhibitor at a usual dose or a PDGFRA inhibitor plus something like doxorubicin at a usual dose. And that's quite toxic, we think, because the myeloid progenitors that depend upon KIT have the same synergy between KIT inhibition and a DNA damaging agent as we're hoping the GIST cells would be. So we're looking for kind of sensitizing doses of some of these drugs. And then the survivors are unraveled by next-gen sequencing in terms of which of the mutation types. And here that V654A if it's KIT or V658A if it's PDGFRA tends to become the survivor if one's treating with a topoisomerase 1 inhibitor. That drug, even though it holds the cells back, annihilates them less effectively than the other second mutations. Whereas for an ATR inhibitor or a WEE1 inhibitor, for instance, it hits all the cells with the different second mutations about equally. Okay, perfect. Okay. So same idea here, but Bella, again, the output of the enhanced mutagenesis screens, we have 3 GIST-T1, that's an exon 11 mutant, sublines with ATP binding pocket mutations, including that V654A, 3 with activation loop mutations. And you just, we won't go pick through them at detail, but to take one example, second row, far right, ATR inhibitor plus TOPO1 inhibitor for Patrick Grohar, who inspired us with a lot of your work on Ewing sarcoma. This is SN38 at 0.5 nanomolar, so it's a reasonable dose to be impressed by. And the ATR inhibitor is at a dose that's about as low as you would ever see published, and we see a substantial additive or synergistic effect compared to either of those on their own. Okay, really quickly, this is clinical data, and that we'll be submitting for publication soon, that I think ushers in a new era of challenge for GIST therapeutics. Now we're talking about APL mutations that I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So ripretinib resistance mechanisms, 25 patients progressing on ripretinib who were biopsied at the time of progression. It was a lesion that was active by PET scan or by other imaging, CAT scan, clearly the progressing lesion. There was a group that progressed time to progression 3 months or less. And that's not huge numbers here, but it looks pretty convincing, usually had either an ATP binding pocket mutation as a second mutation in relationship to exon 11, so the V654A was the most common. So again, evidence, as I alluded to, that ripretinib is probably not quite good enough for most patients who have that V654A resistance mutation. And several of them had exon 9 primary mutations without anything else. So that might be another subset that's not adequately covered by ripretinib. Maybe the most interesting group were patients who clearly had a nice response to ripretinib, but then progressed after 7 to 29 months in this case. And almost all of them started with an activation loop mutation. Ripretinib is an incredibly useful, potent inhibitor of GIST that have a primary mutation plus a second activation loop mutation. That's exon 17 through 18. But now the growing clone has that AL mutation, still the activation loop, plus the ATP binding pocket mutation, the V654A, on the same allele. It's all in cis. Exon 11, V654A, activation loop, AP, AL, that's why we're calling them apples, okay? And the next slide, very quickly just showing that maybe not surprisingly these apples, here again we've done the enhanced mutagenesis to create these models quickly and then done limiting dilutions to purify them, and 822 activation loop mutation with apples that represent either 654, 655, or the gatekeeper 670, and they're all cross-resistant to the other standard drugs for GIST, sunitinib, avapritinib, imatinib. We don't have regorafenib here, okay? Last two slides are just teasers. I mean, up to this point, there was a point, but these last two, just for your interest, okay? Several of the patients progressing on ripretinib have genotypes, if you look across the genome where we started, it's the lower tracing there, that start to look like leiomyosarcoma, profoundly complex. It's not every patient progressing on ripretinib, so this isn't a rule. But it starts one wondering, is there something about the apples where the impact of KIT optimizing DNA damage response now tends to go awry? I doubt it's quite that simple, but that's an area that we're quite interested in. And then because of a nod to the first two talks with their incredibly strong biology, whereas this is a nice translational presentation, I think, those cases have had tertiary lymphoid structures and a level of lymphocytic infiltrate that really is, I won't say it's unprecedented for GIST, but it's mighty unusual for GIST. So if you put 2 and 2 together, more instability, genomic instability by far than we're accustomed to seeing in a subset of GIST cases, and more tendency for immunogenicity. Are those two cause and effect? Are they two unrelated things? We don't know, okay? So in conclusion, we have strong evidence that KIT and PDGFR oncogenic signaling beyond driving growth and survival and the usual things that we understand and just also optimize DNA damage response through Mech, ATR, check, WEE1 pathways. That gives us a number of potential targets to think of as combinations, and that's, I think, a rich area that our group is going to be quite involved in for the years to come. The specific second mutations in KIT that foster imatinib resistance, we have evidence, at least preliminary, that they differ in the way they further dysregulate DNA damage response. I alluded to the V654A. Preclinically, I emphasize, because that's the one I said, I would be pleasantly surprised if this ends up being something that plays out in the clinical spectrum, that even modest inhibition of the KIT target, like what ripretinib does to V654A, is something that we can leverage with an attack downstream at the level of genomic integrity. And then that last question, might indeed just chromosomal instability, whether it's induced by a therapeutic or it's a natural evolution, foster immunogenicity. So this is all work primarily from our group at Brigham and Women's Hospital. Philip, Mijin, and Lydia I've mentioned, Bella, Wenbin Wu, who's always behind these studies. Chan Rout provides the specimens. Adrian provides the vision, right, Philip? Okay. and then in concert, close concert with Sebastian Bauer's group in Essen, Germany, at the West German Cancer Center. They make a myriad of just sublines by CRISPRing in, whereas we like to let the cells figure it out with our enhanced mutagenesis, and those things meet up together nicely. And of course, our incredible colleagues across the street at Dana-Farber, Suzanne George, Candace Haddocks, Andy Wagner, and George Dimitri, and others here have been very involved. Thank you.